On a fog-soaked dawn along the Maine coast, a retired Coast Guard engineer named Eli Moran thought the sea had finally gone silent for him. But when his old rescue dog, Atlas, began barking at a rusted buoy half buried in seaweed, Eli saw its light flicker, an SOS blinking through decades of salt and guilt. Inside the corroded shell was a beacon from the very shipwreck that had destroyed his career, and his faith in mercy. He didn't know it yet, but following that signal would pull him into a tide of lies, redemption, and one final act of grace. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments, and let's see how far this echo from the harbor travels. The winter wind of Rockford, Maine, blew cold and deliberate, carrying with it the salt of the Atlantic and the sighs of things long forgotten. The harbor lay in half ruin, a graveyard of ships, cranes, and rusted buoys swaying like weary heads over still water. Each sound was deliberate: the groan of metal, the creak of rope, the faint clang of a bell buoy somewhere in the fog. It was the kind of place where ghosts did not need to haunt. The air itself remembered for them. Eli Moran stood at the edge of the pier, his gloved hands resting on a splintered railing slick with frost. He was 56, tall but stooped from years of bending over engine bays and rescue vessels. His face was carved by salt and regret, lines deep around his eyes as if life itself had taken a chisel to him. His hair, once dark, had faded to the dull silver of old rope. A beard of 3 days framed his strong jaw, the color of ash and storm. His blue-gray eyes, however, still held a sharpness, a mechanic's precision that had never dulled even as faith and fortune had. He wore the same thing he always wore, a faded navy parka with the old Coast Guard emblem barely visible on the sleeve, thick wool gloves patched at the palms, and boots that looked older than the pier itself. His gait was steady, but each step had the careful rhythm of a man who had learned to live with ghosts that walked beside him. The shack behind him, his home, was a small wooden cabin raised on stilts against the tide. The paint had peeled into scales of gray and white, the windows fogged from within by a small heater that hummed weakly. Inside were the essentials: a stove, a radio, 2 mugs, one used every morning, one kept clean for no one. On the counter sat a framed photograph, turned face down. Only the corner of a woman's smile peeked from beneath the glass. The air smelled faintly of engine oil and seaweed, a scent that clung to Eli as much as memory. His only companion was Atlas, a 9-year-old German shepherd whose fur had once been black and tan, but now shimmered silver-gray under the dull morning light. One ear was notched from an old rescue mission, and his muzzle had whitened like frost on stone. Atlas's eyes were amber and intelligent, alert but calm, watching the horizon the way soldiers watch the line between safety and danger. He was a large dog, powerful but deliberate in movement, his gait steady even on the slick wooden pier. He had the patience of something that had seen storms and waited for them to pass. The people in Rockford called Atlas the last Coast Guard dog, though the title belonged more to nostalgia than truth. Every morning, Eli and Atlas walked the perimeter of the harbor. It wasn't duty anymore. It was ritual. They checked the locks on the equipment sheds, inspected the old rescue boats moored out of use, and ensured no one stole what no one wanted. The town had once buzzed with fishermen and shipping crews. Now it was only the wind and the two of them. Most folks had left when the storms grew worse and the shipping lanes shifted south. A few old-timers stayed, men who still smelled of bait and diesel, who nodded to Eli but did not speak long. They pitied him quietly, some because they knew his story, others because they didn't need to. In 2009, a rescue vessel under Eli's supervision had failed mid-operation during a hurricane off George Bank. The flotation systems, Phao Q Ho he had signed off on, had malfunctioned. The crew of 8 never came home. The investigation named it maintenance oversight, official words for his fault. The guilt never left him. It simply changed shape. Now it lived in the silence between waves. Atlas barked once, sharply, and Eli turned. The dog stood near the end of the dock, tail stiff, nose lifted toward the gray horizon. "Nothing out there, boy," Eli muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. The fog thickened, swallowing the far edge of the pier. For a moment, Eli thought he heard a low hum, the kind of electronic throb that used to echo from distress beacons. He waited. Only the ocean answered. He shook his head, pushing the memory away. The mind, like the sea, sometimes dredged up what it should leave buried. He walked back toward the shack, boots crunching on the thin layer of frost, and Atlas followed, silent again. Inside, the small heater glowed red, and Eli poured water into a dented kettle. The radio on the shelf crackled faintly with static. Old channels still set to Coast Guard frequencies out of habit. Every few seconds, a faint pulse of sound interrupted the static. Not quite words, not quite silence. Eli stared at it, then reached over and turned the knob to mute. He had stopped listening years ago. He sat at the small wooden table, the same one he'd built from the deck of a decommissioned lifeboat. Atlas lay beside him, head on paws, eyes half-lidded but never fully asleep. Eli traced the grain of the table with a calloused thumb and whispered, almost to himself, "You ever think the sea forgives, boy?" Atlas opened one eye, amber glint catching the firelight, as if answering in his own silent way. The kettle whistled, sharp and short like a warning. Eli rose, poured the water into his mug, and watched the steam curl upward into the dim air. Outside, the fog pressed against the window, alive and heavy. In the distance, a faint metallic clink echoed across the harbor, a buoy knocking against something unseen. Atlas lifted his head again, ears pricking. Eli stared into the fog. "Tomorrow," he said softly. "We'll check it tomorrow." But the sound continued, rhythmic, almost patterned, as though the ocean itself were tapping out a message. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. SOS. Eli's fingers tightened on the mug, the steam fogging his eyes. The harbor was supposed to be dead, yet somehow it was calling him again. The fog that morning rolled in thick as milk, swallowing the harbor whole until even the nearest pier seemed to fade into nothing. The world smelled of salt and iron and wet rope. Eli Moran woke before dawn, stirred not by habit but by the restless movement of Atlas at his feet. The German shepherd's ears were sharp points against the pale light creeping through the cabin window. His tail twitched once, twice. Then he barked. A deep, resonant sound that broke the silence like a flare against gray sky. Eli grumbled and pulled on his coat, the heavy navy parka still damp from the day before. The cold hit him immediately as he stepped outside, slicing into his lungs like glass. "What is it now, boy?" he muttered, following Atlas down the narrow path that led to the beach. The dog moved with purpose, head low, body tense, every movement guided by instinct older than memory. The fog made everything ghostly. The dunes, the rotting hulls of old boats, even the sea itself which hissed faintly somewhere beyond the white wall of mist. Then he saw it. Among the rack of seaweed and broken driftwood, something blinked, soft, rhythmic light against the gray dawn. Atlas barked again, circling it, his paws kicking up wet sand. Eli slowed, his heartbeat beginning to thud in his ears. It was a life buoy, half buried, its red paint long bleached to a pale rose and cracked from years of salt. He recognized the design instantly, the old Mark IV flotation beacons used on Coast Guard rescue vessels. He hadn't seen one since the investigation. A tag still clung to its side, worn but legible: Mariner Dynamics, Batch 09 Tide. Eli froze. That was the same batch number from the wreck of the Mercy Star, the mission that had ended 8 lives and his career. He crouched, his knees popping with age, and brushed sand from the device. The rubber was brittle under his gloves. Inside the transparent housing, the signal light pulsed steadily. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. SOS. But the battery compartment was corroded through, salt crystals blooming around the edges like white mold. No modern cell could survive that decay. "Impossible," he whispered. The cold made his voice brittle. He turned it over. The beacon was intact, but lifeless in every mechanical sense. And yet, the light refused to die. Atlas tilted his head, whined softly, then stepped closer to sniff the object. His breath fogged the surface. Eli felt a tremor move through him, half awe, half fear. The rational part of him, the engineer, sought explanation. Residual charge, faulty diode, some chemical reaction in the circuitry. But the man beneath, the one who had prayed and cursed and begged for forgiveness, felt something else entirely. The sea was talking again. A distant sound broke his thoughts. Footsteps on gravel. He looked up and saw a woman approaching through the fog, a silhouette growing sharper with each step. She carried a thermos and a clipboard tucked under her arm, her stride brisk despite the cold. It was June Harrow, the harbor's maintenance inspector, a woman in her early 40s with wind-burned cheeks and dark auburn hair tied back in a ponytail. Her build was wiry, the kind of strength earned from years hauling gear rather than lifting weights. She was practical, even tempered, but sharp in the way of someone who'd had to prove herself twice as hard in a world of men. "You're out early," she said, voice clear and low. "Fog's thick enough to lose a boat in your own driveway." Eli nodded, still kneeling beside the buoy. "Atlas found this washed up." June crouched next to him, her brown eyes narrowing at the blinking light. "Old model. Shouldn't even be active. Where'd it come from?" "That's what I'd like to know," Eli muttered. He pointed to the tag. June leaned in. "Mariner Dynamics, Batch 09 Tide. That's ancient." She glanced at him. "Weren't you the one on the Mercy Star case?" Her tone was careful, not accusatory. Still, the question landed like a knife. "Yeah," Eli said quietly. "I was." For a long moment, neither spoke. The light kept blinking, slicing through fog in its calm, unearthly rhythm. Finally, June straightened, brushing sand from her jeans. "I'll have the Coast Guard pick it up for disposal. Probably some junk kicked loose by the storms." "No," Eli said quickly. "I'll handle it. I want to check the circuitry first." She gave him a long, assessing look. "You think it's connected?" "I don't know what to think." She sighed, the sound fogging the air between them. "All right. Just don't get lost chasing ghosts, Eli." Then she turned and vanished into the mist, her boots crunching until even that sound was gone. Eli watched her disappear before turning back to the buoy. He lifted it carefully, feeling its weight, too light for a power source still working. Atlas followed close, his fur damp, eyes bright. They climbed back to the shack, the fog curling around them like smoke. Inside, Eli set the buoy on his workbench. He grabbed a screwdriver, pried open the casing, and stared at the corroded wiring. The copper was green, eaten through the board slick with salt. It shouldn't light. It couldn't. And yet the small bulb pulsed on, steady, patient, alive. He sat back, heart hammering. The kettle on the stove hissed softly, filling the room with the smell of burnt coffee grounds. Atlas lay beside him, head on paws, watching his every move. The harbor outside was silent except for the slow, steady beat of the foghorn, a sound that today felt almost like a heartbeat. Eli whispered, "If this is your idea of mercy, Lord, it's a cruel one." The light answered him in silence, still flashing its impossible code through the haze of the harbor morning. By the time the fog began to lift, the harbor had settled into that strange, colorless calm that came after a storm. Everything damp, muted, and half asleep. Eli Moran sat hunched over the workbench inside his shack, the lifebuoy resting like an accusation before him. The small bulb inside it still flickered faintly, though he had already pried out the corroded battery pack. The scent of salt and rust filled the air, mixing with the bitter smell of instant coffee gone cold. Atlas lay nearby on the floorboards, his body curled but his head up, golden eyes never leaving his master. The dog's fur was still damp from the morning mist, clumped along his shoulders, and each slow exhale came out as a soft huff against the quiet. Eli adjusted the magnifying lamp, its circle of white light falling over the open casing. The board inside was a graveyard of oxidation. Copper turned green, wires eaten through like veins under frost. He picked up a small screwdriver, twisting it between his fingers. His hands were steady, though the scars across his knuckles, thin, white, and shiny, caught the light. "You're not supposed to work," he muttered, half to himself, half to the ghost of the device. "Not after 14 years. The bulb pulsed once more, weaker now, as though mocking him. The logical explanation was simple enough. Residual voltage leaking across a shorted circuit. The old auto-activation relay might still be trying to send a signal even as it died. But logic rarely stopped guilt from whispering. A knock came on the door, short and polite. Eli sighed. "Come in, June." The door opened to reveal June Harrow, the harbor inspector he'd met earlier that morning. She had shed her outer jacket, revealing a dark wool sweater over faded jeans and work boots streaked with mud. The cold had flushed her cheeks pink, and the clipboard she carried looked like a shield she hadn't meant to bring. "You didn't answer the radio," she said. "I figured you were still dissecting your ghost." "Just a malfunction," he said, eyes on the table. "Residual current tripping the LED. The thing's dead, just doesn't know it yet." She stepped closer, scanning the inside of the buoy. "Looks worse than I expected. Corrosion like that doesn't happen overnight." "No, years of salt will do this. Years and silence." His voice drifted, heavy as the air. June leaned against the doorframe, crossing her arms. "You sure it's not something more? Maybe the universe's way of poking you in the ribs?" Eli gave a short, dry laugh. "If the universe wants to poke me, it'll need more than a dead boy." She smiled faintly, but her eyes remained serious. June was the kind of woman who didn't speak in riddles. Life had trained her to trust what she could fix with her own 2 hands. She had grown up in Rockford, daughter of a fisherman who'd vanished one winter and never come back. That loss had built the core of her. Practicality, forged by grief. She studied Eli for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether to leave him alone or drag him out of his ghosts. "You want me to file this as salvage?" she asked finally. "You don't need it haunting your bench." Eli shook his head. "I'll keep it. Reminds me that things don't stay dead just because we stop checking on them." June hesitated, then nodded and stepped back into the doorway. "All right, Moran. Just don't start seeing omens where there's only bad wiring." She left without waiting for a reply. The sound of her boots on the dock faded into the gulls. Eli sat for a while longer, staring at the gutted beacon. He thought about the day of the storm, the frantic voices on the radio, the wave that tore the Mercy Star apart, the silence that followed. He remembered how the official report had used words like equipment failure and human oversight, but none that meant forgiveness. The kettle clicked off behind him, breaking his trance. He poured a mug, black and scalding, and sat by the window. Outside, the harbor stretched flat and pale, dotted with shadows of boats that would never sail again. The buoy's light had gone dark at last. Atlas shifted beside him, letting out a low groan as he settled against Eli's boot. The man reached down, absently scratching the rough fur behind the dog's ear. "Guess that's it, boy," he murmured. "False alarm." The words felt heavier than they should have, each syllable like a small surrender. He set the mug down, still full, and looked out toward the sea. The fog was lifting, but in its place came a thin drizzle that made the horizon vanish once more. Atlas's head lifted, gaze fixed towards the water. His ears twitched, then relaxed. He was calm again, but watchful. Eli followed his gaze, though he saw nothing. Only waves, gray upon gray, moving like an old memory that refused to rest. "You and me both, huh?" Eli whispered. "Expired equipment, still trying to send out a signal." Atlas thumped his tail once, a quiet sound against the wood, and rested his chin on Eli's boot. The man looked down at him, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Outside, the drizzle deepened into rain, gentle but relentless. The tide came in, licking the shore, and somewhere far out at sea, a distant buoy answered with a lonely, hollow clang. Eli closed his eyes and let the sound wash through him, a reminder that even false alarms came from something once alive. The morning after the false alarm, Rockford Harbor was drenched in rain that came down in silver curtains, steady and without mercy. Eli Moran trudged across the slick pier, his boots thudding softly on the wet planks, the smell of brine thick in the air. Atlas trotted beside him, fur soaked to the skin but unbothered, his breath rising in visible puffs. The rain blurred the horizon, turning the entire dockyard into one endless gray smear between sea and sky. Eli had spent half the night thinking about that dead buoy. He told himself it was nothing, just a broken relic doing what broken things do, pretending to work. But the thought gnawed at him. If that piece of junk had drifted from somewhere nearby, what else might the tide be hiding? When he reached the far end of the yard, he unlocked the rusted gate to the old container lot. The place was a graveyard of storage crates, weathered steel boxes arranged in crooked rows, numbers faded, doors dented, and warped from years of neglect. Most were filled with retired Coast Guard gear, waiting for disposal or resale. Eli's job was simple. Check the inventory tags, log the condition, make sure no one stripped the copper wiring. Simple work for a man who had stopped wanting challenges. Atlas sniffed along the ground, tail low but wagging slightly, every muscle tuned to the scents that salt and rust had tried to erase. His gait was slower these days, the stiffness in his hind legs showing when he turned too quickly, but the old instincts were still there, the precision of a trained K9 who had spent years detecting danger that humans couldn't smell. Eli knelt by a crate labeled E10, brushing rainwater from the tag. He scribbled a few notes in his logbook, then moved on to the next. E11. Empty. Door half open. Inside only old ropes and cracked helmets. When he reached E12, Atlas suddenly stopped. The dog's head lifted, ears erect, nostrils flaring. A deep rumble formed in his chest, not loud but sharp enough to freeze Eli mid-step. "What is it, boy?" Eli asked quietly. Atlas ignored him. The dog took 3 deliberate steps forward, his paws squelching in the mud, then began to scratch at the ground beneath the front of the container. His nails hit something solid, metal buried under a thin layer of sand and dirt. The smell hit Eli next, sharp, chemical, and strange, a mix of burnt plastic, iodine, and something acrid that stung his throat. It wasn't the usual scent of diesel or sea decay. It was industrial. Wrong. Eli crouched beside Atlas, pressing the back of his hand against the container wall. The steel was warm, unnaturally so for a rainy morning. He frowned and pulled a handheld air quality meter from his tool belt. The small digital screen flickered to life. A few seconds later, numbers began to spike. Chlorine concentration: 14.20 ppm, far beyond what sea air could explain. That can't be right, he muttered. He recalibrated the sensor, tried again. The reading jumped, higher. Atlas gave a low whine, backing up, tail stiff. Easy, Eli said, rising slowly. He walked around to the side of the container, running his palm along the metal seams. Most of the weld lines were old, dull, pitted with rust, but one section near the base caught his attention. It gleamed faintly beneath the grime, the weld bead thick and uneven, too recent. He scraped at it with his pocket knife, and bright silver showed through. Someone had sealed it recently, but not well. The rain hissed on the metal as he stepped back. His mind began stitching together possibilities. The container yard was supposed to hold decommissioned rescue equipment, life vests, flares, radios, not sealed crates emitting chlorine vapor. Who would weld one shut without record? And why? Atlas began circling the crate again, sniffing the corners, barking once, short, sharp, urgent. Eli glanced toward the harbor office in the distance, where a single light glowed behind fogged glass. He thought of June Harrow, the inspector, and considered calling her, but stopped. The last thing he needed was to sound paranoid about another ghost signal. He wiped rain from his face and crouched again, pressing his ear against the steel wall. For a moment, there was only the hiss of rain. Then, faint but distinct, he heard something. A slow drip, like liquid hitting metal from inside the container. The smell grew stronger. "All right," he said under his breath. "We're not touching this barehanded." He returned to his truck, retrieved a pair of thick rubber gloves, and came back to the container. Atlas followed, pacing, his fur bristling along the spine. Eli crouched again and examined the weld. The heat had been too high. Slag bubbles, uneven penetration, classic signs of someone working fast and careless. He traced the pattern with one gloved finger. It wasn't factory work. This was done by someone trying to hide, not protect. He took a single photograph with his old phone, just in case, and logged the coordinates in his notebook. As he did, a sharp gust of wind swept through the yard, rattling every loose door in the line of containers. The sound rose into a hollow metallic chorus that made Atlas bark again, louder this time. Eli turned toward him, voice calm but firm. "Stay. Good boy." Atlas stopped barking but stayed rigid, eyes fixed on E12. The rain began to ease, leaving only the drip of water from the corners of the crates. Eli looked once more at the container, the crude weld gleaming like a scar, and felt the old unease return. The same cold twist that had come the day before when the buoy had blinked from the sand. He stood for a long moment in the silence that followed, his breath clouding faintly in the damp air. "Whatever's in there," he murmured. "Someone didn't want it found." Atlas gave a quiet growl, low and steady. Eli rested a hand on the dog's neck, feeling the tension thrumming under the wet fur. The warmth from the steel behind him seemed to breathe like something alive. Rain had thinned to a mist by the time Eli Moran reached the harbor office, its single fluorescent light buzzing above a desk cluttered with shipping manifests and unpaid invoices. The air smelled of paper gone damp, of salt and coffee long burnt. Eli shook water from his parka, set his notebook down, and switched on the desk lamp. The yellow glow fell across stacks of maintenance logs and storage ledgers, records he'd been half ignoring for years. But now he flipped through them with new urgency. Each page was a small geography of negligence, numbers fading into mildew, dates smudged by time. He ran his finger down the column marked Container Registry. 2023 update. The list went from E10 to E11, then jumped straight to E13. No mention of E12. He checked older logs, back to 2015. Still nothing. Whoever added that container had done it off record. And if chlorine vapors were leaking inside, it wasn't just sloppy bookkeeping. It was criminal negligence. Atlas lay near the door, eyes half open, one ear twitching at every sound from the pier. Eli stared at the empty space on the paper until his vision blurred. The logical step was to call June Harrow, the inspector, but something in him resisted. Part pride, part instinct. Instead, he reached for the old black phone mounted to the wall. Its cord was coiled like a sleeping snake, sticky with salt. He dialed from memory. After 3 rings, a gravelly voice answered. Tom Delgado speaking. "Tom," Eli said, exhaling relief. "It's Moran." There was a pause, then a low whistle. "Eli? Damn, haven't heard that name since the world still thought we knew what we were doing." The voice belonged to a man who had smoked too many years and slept too few. Tom Delgado had once been the chief technical manager for Mariner Dynamics, the company contracted to build and maintain Coast Guard flotation systems. He was in his early 60s now, thick-bodied and graying, the kind of man whose posture had never recovered from years of bending over assembly lines. Eli could almost see him in his mind. Broad shoulders, coffee-stained shirt, beard like steel wool. Tom had always been blunt, capable, and allergic to corporate nonsense. It was what got him quietly pushed out after the Mercy Star tragedy. "I need to ask about something," Eli said. "Found a container marked E12 in the Rockford yard. No record of it. Smells of chlorine. Bad welds. Fresh." "E12?" Tom repeated, tone sharpening. "You sure of the code?" "Yeah, I logged it myself." There was the sound of a lighter flicking, the faint hiss of smoke. "Eli, that number shouldn't exist. The E-series were phased out a decade ago." "So I figured. But this one's sitting here leaking gas and looking brand new. I ran a scan, chlorine readings through the roof." Silence stretched across the line, heavy and thick. Then Tom spoke, voice lower. "You said the welds were fresh. Listen, do me a favor. Look at the plate on the back of the container. You'll see a contractor ID." Eli walked to the window, rain streaking the glass, and flipped through his notes. "Got it, MD714R. Another silence. "You're not going to like this," Tom muttered. "That's Mariner Dynamics. The same contractor ID we used on the 09 Tide batch, the one from the Mercy Star incident." Eli gripped the phone tighter. "That can't be right. Those components were supposed to be scrapped." "They were. On paper," Tom said. His voice trembled slightly, just enough for Eli to notice. "We were told the batch was destroyed after the investigation. But a few of us had doubts. Too many gaps in disposal records. Too many forms signed off by people who didn't exist. I asked questions. You know what happened next?" "You got transferred." "Forced into retirement," Tom corrected, a dry laugh escaping him. "My reward for being inconvenient." Eli rubbed his forehead, the weight of the past 14 years pressing in. "You're telling me those units could still be out there? Reused?" "Or rebranded," Tom said. "Eli, I need you to be careful. Mariner's under new ownership now. Private contractors, not government regulated. They don't like attention, and they sure as hell don't want anyone digging up old messes." "I'm not digging. I'm standing in it. Eli replied, glancing toward the fog beyond the window. Then get out before it swallows you too. Tom's voice softened. Look, I'll check my old archives. Still have some backup drives. If I find anything linking Hohenheim Tide to a recent shipment, I'll call you. Thanks, Tom. Don't thank me yet. And Eli, keep that dog close. Sometimes things leak for a reason. The line clicked dead. Eli stood there for a long moment, staring at the silent phone. Outside, Atlas gave a low bark, tail stiff. Something thudded faintly against the wall of the shack, like a rope or loose chain in the wind. Eli crossed to the door and opened it. The yard was empty, fog swirling in slow, gray waves. He could smell the sea and, faintly, that same chemical tang that clung to his clothes from E12. He stepped out, scanning the rows of containers in the distance. For the first time in years, the harbor didn't feel empty. It felt watched. Atlas moved closer to him, ears forward, body tense. Eli looked down at the dog, then back toward the office phone. Mariner Dynamics, he whispered. What the hell are you still doing here? Night had fallen thick and low over Rockford Harbor, wrapping the docks in a blue-gray fog that swallowed light whole. The wind carried the scent of salt, oil, and rain-soaked metal. Eli Moran drove his battered pickup along the gravel lane that led to the storage yard, headlights carving two pale tunnels through the mist. Atlas sat upright in the passenger seat, his gray fur glinting faintly in the dashboard glow. His ears flicked at every sound beyond the glass. Seagulls crying in the dark, a rope slapping wood, the faint metallic hum of wind through hollow steel. The dog seemed to sense the tension in his master's shoulders. Eli's hands gripped the wheel tighter than usual, knuckles white under weathered skin. He had spent all day replaying his call with Tom Delgado, the name Mariner Dynamics echoing like a curse in his mind. That company had cost him his career, and 8 men their lives. And now, 14 years later, its ghost was welded shut inside his yard. When he parked, the engine clicked and hissed as it cooled. The air outside was cold enough to sting his lungs. He grabbed the heavy plasma cutter from the truck bed, slung the cable over his shoulder, and checked the portable generator. Fuel half full, humming steady. Atlas leapt down beside him, paws splashing through puddles. "Stay close, old man," Eli muttered. The dog gave a low whine in acknowledgement. Together they walked toward container E12. The mist curled around it like smoke from a slow fire. Eli crouched to inspect the welded seam again. Even under the beam of his flashlight, it gleamed too bright, too new. The sloppy line of fused metal looked like a scar hastily stitched. He set up the generator, the hum breaking the silence of the harbor, and flipped his helmet down. The cutter's torch ignited with a scream of light. Sparks cascaded down like falling stars as molten steel hissed and split apart. The air filled with the acrid tang of burning polymer and paint. Atlas backed a few steps, nose wrinkling. The first cut went smooth, the second slower. The steel was thicker here, almost reinforced. Eli worked with methodical precision, each motion practiced, controlled, the way he used to when fixing rescue vessel engines before the storm that ended everything. The moment the final seam cracked, a thin jet of white smoke hissed from the gap, curling in the cold air. The smell that followed made him flinch. Plastic and iodine, chemical rot. He shut off the torch, lifted his visor, and waited for the air to clear. When he pried the door open with a crowbar, it came loose with a groan, like something exhaling after too long. Inside, the beam of his flashlight cut through the dark and froze. The container was packed from floor to ceiling with maritime gear. Life vests, buoys, flare guns, emergency beacons, all meticulously arranged, all branded Mariner Dynamics. every label bore the same printed promise: certified safety equipment, U.S. Coast Standard. But the truth was already written in their imperfections: the uneven stitching, mismatched fabric, crooked serial stamps. On the inner wall, a painted stencil read, "For Offshore Humanitarian Aid, 2023. Humanitarian aid, Eli said softly. His voice cracked in disbelief. They're laundering salvage. He stepped inside, boots clanging against the metal floor. The air was stifling, thick with polymer fumes. He crouched near a stack of life jackets, running his gloved hand over the tags. Each one bore a false certification date, all within the last 6 months. He found beacon units still sealed in plastic. When he peeled one open, the casing was corroded, battery cells leaking powder. They weren't new. They were refurbished junk disguised as fresh stock. Gear meant to save lives now turned into death traps. Atlas stood in the doorway, growling softly. Eli turned to see his reflection in the dog's amber eyes, helmet off, gray hair matted with sweat, a man half lit by guilt and firelight. They never stopped, he whispered. They just changed the label. He snapped photographs, tags, seals, stencils, the whole rotten evidence trail. Then he found something that made his heart stop. At the back of the container, taped to the wall above a crate of sealed buoys, was a manifest list stamped with the Mariner Dynamics logo. At the bottom, written in black pen, was the contractor's local liaison. Supervisor L. Harrow, Rockford Division. Eli's breath caught. Harrow. The name hit like cold iron. He thought of June, her clipped tone, her inspections, her quiet insistence that everything at the harbor was routine. The idea slammed into place like a door. Either she didn't know, or she knew exactly. The flashlight trembled in his hand. He stepped back, mind racing. The sound of the generator outside had grown uneven, sputtering. Atlas barked once, sharp and urgent, snapping him back. "All right, boy," Eli said, grabbing the photos and manifest. "We're done here." He shut the container, but not before taking one last look at the stacked sea of false salvation inside. Then he killed the generator, plunging the yard back into silence. Only the waves moved now, slapping against the pier like slow applause. As he loaded the tools into the truck, Atlas leapt in first, shaking off the damp air. Eli climbed behind the wheel and sat for a long moment without starting the engine. The fog had thickened again, pressing close to the glass. He could see the faint silhouette of E-12 in the mirror, its steel face expressionless, its secret exposed but not yet spoken. "Tomorrow," Eli muttered, voice hoarse. "Tomorrow we talk." The dog's ears flicked at his tone, and for the first time in years, Eli felt something dangerous stirring under his guilt. Not fear, not regret, but purpose. Morning crept into Rockford Harbor like a ghost that refused to leave. The fog still clung to the water, heavy and low, muffling every sound except the slow knock of the tide against the pylons. Eli Moran hadn't slept. His eyes were bloodshot. His hands still smelled of burned polymer and rust. The evidence sat before him on his workbench. Photographs, a forged manifest, and a single life buoy he had taken from the container before sealing it shut again. It was cracked along one edge, its white paint yellowed with age, and the faded letters Mariner Dynamics barely visible beneath a new layer of stenciled ink that read, Humanitarian Aid, 2023. Atlas lay beside the desk, his head resting on his paws, eyes following every movement of his master. The German shepherd looked tired, too, the kind of fatigue that went beyond muscle. His right ear, the one scarred and nicked from an old storm rescue, twitched whenever Eli's chair creaked. The man reached for his magnifier and turned the buoy over. Beneath the new serial sticker, something older glimmered faintly under the light. He scraped at it with the edge of his knife, careful, patient. A line of numbers emerged, smudged but legible. 09 Tide 418. For a moment he couldn't breathe. His throat went dry, his chest locked. That serial was carved into his nightmares. It was the exact model listed in the report. The batch of emergency buoys that had failed to deploy during the Mercy Star disaster. 8 crew members had died in the freezing Atlantic that night. Their bodies recovered days later. Eli had signed off on the inspection for those buoys 2 weeks before the crash. Every night since, he had replayed the moment in his head. The signature, the stamp, the small mechanical hiss that might have been fate sealing itself shut. His career had ended there. His faith in himself had drowned with them. Now that number sat before him, proof that the equipment had never been defective by design. It had been counterfeit. "No," he whispered, his voice cracking. "No, you can't." He flipped the buoy fully over, tracing the indentations where the old tag had been crudely filled and repainted. The material beneath was brittle, sun-baked, easily a decade old. "They lied," he murmured, each word trembling. "They lied, and we took the blame." Atlas rose slowly, sensing the shift in his master's voice. The dog pressed his head against Eli's thigh, the coarse fur warm beneath his calloused hand. Eli didn't move for a long moment. The workshop's hum, the low buzz of the lamp, the drip of condensation faded into a dull roar in his ears. The guilt that had lived in him for 6 years began to crack like ice under thawing sun. He exhaled sharply, a sound halfway between a sob and a laugh. "All this time." His voice broke, and he pressed a trembling hand over his mouth. He thought of the men who had trusted him. Captain Reed with his weather-cracked grin. Young Cole, the radio operator, who always carried licorice in his coat pocket. He remembered their faces in the rescue report photographs, frozen mid-expression by the sea. He had carried their ghosts for years, believing he'd killed them through neglect. But the truth was simpler, crueler. They'd been murdered by greed. Atlas nudged him again, whining softly. Eli dropped the knife, sank to his knees, and rested his forehead against the dog's neck. His shoulders shook once, twice, then broke completely. He laughed through the tears, a dry, broken laugh that startled even him. It wasn't joy. It was release. "You hear that, boy?" he said hoarsely. "It wasn't me. It was never me." Atlas responded the only way he knew how, by licking the man's hand once, slow and deliberate, his tail thumping faintly against the floor. The gesture pulled Eli back from the edge. He drew a ragged breath and straightened, wiping his face with the back of his sleeve. "They buried it," he muttered, staring at the buoy. "They buried everything." He took a pen and scrawled the number 09 Tide 418 across the top of his notebook in thick, angry strokes. Beneath it, he wrote proof of fraud. Then he looked toward the window. Outside, dawn was breaking, a thin silver light spreading over the harbor. The fog was lifting, revealing the outlines of ships, cranes, and the dull glint of the water. The world looked the same, but to Eli it was changed utterly. He rose, moving with a steadiness that hadn't been in him for years. He placed the buoy gently on the table next to the manifest with June Harrow's name, and took one last look at them together, the lie and the truth side by side. "We're not done, Atlas," he said quietly. "Not by a long shot." The dog's ears perked, as if understanding. Eli switched off the lamp, pocketed his camera, and stepped outside. The cold morning air bit at his cheeks, but for the first time, it felt clean. The night had settled deep over Rockford Harbor, cold and still, with the kind of silence that came after a decision had already been made. Inside the wooden shack, the only light came from Eli Moran's aging laptop. its blue glow washing over his lined face and the stacks of evidence scattered across the desk. The buoy with the serial 09 Tide 418 sat beside his coffee mug, its surface dull and scarred, a relic that had burned through 6 years of guilt to deliver truth. The air was heavy with salt and electricity. Atlas lay by the door, his body half shadow, half light, ears twitching at the sound of wind brushing against the windows. He didn't sleep. The dog never did when Eli worked this late. It was as if he understood that some nights demanded witnesses. Eli's fingers moved steadily over the keyboard, slow but deliberate, the rhythm of a man who'd spent his life documenting, logging, fixing. He renamed files, cross-checked dates, verified coordinates. Every photograph, every note was a blade sharpened against lies, the welded seam on container E12, the falsified certification stamps, the manifest with L. Harrow, Rockford Division printed in bold ink, and finally the buoy bearing the cursed serial 09 Tide 418. Together they formed a chain of proof strong enough to sink a corporation, but only if he could keep it safe. The old laptop whirred as he inserted an encrypted drive, a small black rectangle marked with masking tape, and the word Helios. He had built it years ago during his time with the Coast Guard's Systems Division, a fail-safe program designed to store mission data in duplicate nodes. Back then, it was a precaution against storms. Now it would become a weapon. He ran the script. 3 upload bars appeared on the screen, each heading toward a different digital shore. One to a private offshore server in Iceland, one to a Swiss data vault, and one, the most hidden, to a ghost directory on the Federal Maritime Agency's intranet. "Come on," Eli muttered under his breath. "Just hold together a little longer." The laptop fan rattled, coughing out heat as the progress climbed. The dog stirred, rising to his feet, nails clicking softly on the floorboards. Atlas padded closer and sat at Eli's side, his golden brown eyes reflecting the flicker of code. His fur had taken on a silvery sheen under the lamplight, and there was wisdom in the way he watched. Calm, patient, eternal. Eli reached down, resting a hand on the dog's neck, grounding himself in that quiet loyalty. "Almost done, partner." He opened a small notepad, writing a short message, simple and direct. "If this reaches you, I'm gone. The evidence is attached. Do what's right." He addressed it to 2 recipients. The first was the Federal Maritime Commission, flagged urgent, safety and fraud inquiry. The second was the Portland Herald, a major newspaper known for its investigative division. He'd once met one of their reporters years ago, a sharp woman named Evelyn Cruz, mid-30s, with jet-black hair and a reputation for chasing government corruption until the walls cracked. She'd written a piece after the Mercy Star tragedy. "When protocol fails, who pays the tide?" Eli remembered her as relentless, skeptical, but fair. He typed her address carefully. She had been one of the few who didn't call him a murderer. The uploads reached completion. Eli exhaled. Then he executed the final step, the switch. He opened a small command window and entered the phrase, Hydra Protocol. The code blinked alive. In 24 hours, unless Eli entered a unique login phrase, a single line of verification typed into a hidden terminal, the program would automatically dispatch the evidence files and message to both destinations. If he was dead, silenced, or arrested, the truth would surface anyway. There would be no stopping it. The weight of it sat in his chest, not fear, but inevitability. He leaned back, rubbing his eyes. "That's it, boy," he said softly. "Insurance policy." Atlas gave a low chuff, almost like agreement, before settling back near the door, his head resting on his paws, gaze still fixed on Eli. Outside, the harbor groaned. Wind pushed against the boards, and somewhere in the distance a buoy clanged, slow and hollow, like a bell tolling from another life. Eli watched the progress log finish, then unplugged the drive. He tucked it into a small metal box beneath the floorboard, the same space where he kept his father's watch and the folded flag from his discharge ceremony. For the first time in years, he felt something approaching calm. The ghosts of the Mercy Star were quieter now, though not gone. He poured himself a shot of cheap bourbon, the kind that burned clean, and raised it toward the window. "To them," he whispered, "and to truth that doesn't sink." He drank, grimacing as it hit. The screen dimmed, displaying a countdown, 23 hours, 59 minutes remaining. He turned off the lamp. The glow of the monitor lingered like a last ember in the dark. Outside, the wind shifted, bringing with it the faint smell of diesel and brine. Atlas lifted his head, ears pricked, eyes narrowing. Eli noticed, too. Headlights, faint, distant, crawling along the road from the upper docks. A vehicle. At this hour. He reached over and closed the laptop. The countdown ticked silently beneath the lid. "Looks like someone doesn't want to wait 24 hours, he murmured. Atlas growled, deep and steady. Eli's jaw tightened. Then let them come. 2 days later, the Atlantic gleamed like molten glass beyond the skyscrapers of Portland's business district. The building that bore the logo Mariner Dynamics rose from the harbor front like a monument to everything Eli Moran had once believed in. Precision, trust, and pride. Now it looked to him like a mirror made to blind the guilty. The lobby was all marble and silence. Eli's reflection followed him across the polished floor, a weathered man in a sea of glass. His hair had gone almost entirely gray, trimmed short, and his eyes, blue once, now faded steel, carried the weight of a man who had long since stopped expecting redemption. He wore his old Coast Guard jacket, the one with frayed cuffs and salt stains, the color of worn navy faded by time. Atlas padded beside him, leash loose in Eli's hand, the dog's coat silver gray and gleaming under the sunlight streaming through the atrium. A young receptionist looked up, startled. "Sir, you can't bring—" she started, then stopped when Eli's gaze met hers, calm, firm, but unyielding. "I have an appointment with Richard Hale," he said. His voice carried authority that needed no badge. The woman hesitated, then buzzed security clearance without another word. The elevator doors closed behind them with a soft, metallic sigh. The 42nd floor opened into a vast office framed by ocean light. Behind a glass desk sat Richard Hale, CEO of Mariner Dynamics. Hale was in his late 50s, tall and broad-shouldered, his tan the expensive kind earned under private suns. His gray hair was styled back with precision, and his tailored charcoal suit fit like armor. He smiled when Eli entered, a practiced corporate smile, all courtesy and calculation. "Mr. Moran," he said smoothly, standing. "It's been a long time since we've had the honor of a visit from one of our former engineers." Eli stopped halfway across the room, Atlas at his heel, and set a large manila envelope on the table. "Honor's not the word I'd use," he replied. Hale's smile didn't falter, but the air tightened. "Please, sit. Can I offer you something? Coffee? Water?" "You can offer truth," Eli said flatly. He remained standing. The CEO's assistant, Mara Quinn, lingered near the corner, a woman in her mid-30s, sharp-faced, slim, with hair the color of polished copper twisted into a tight bun. She wore a neutral expression, tablet in hand, but her green eyes flicked between the two men like a hawk measuring wind. Eli slid the envelope forward. It hit the glass desk with a dull slap. "Inside are photographs, serial logs, and recordings," he said, "including one from your former technical manager, Tom Delgado. He confirms that Batch No 9 Tide was never destroyed. Your company rebranded it, sold it again as humanitarian aid last year. Hale's hand paused on the desk. Tom Delgado? Yes. He thought confession might ease his conscience. He didn't live to see if it worked. Eli's tone was calm, but the words hung like a storm cloud. Hale leaned back slowly, folding his hands. You think coming here, threatening me with old rumors will fix something? No, Eli said. It's not a threat. It's a mirror. I came to give you one chance to do what's right before the world sees what you are. He opened the envelope and spread several photographs across the table. The fake seals, the welded container, the buoy-marked Euro 9 Tide 418. Hale's mask slipped for the first time. The man's tan drained slightly, his jaw tightening. He stared at the serial number as if it had claws. Eli's voice stayed level, steady as the tide. Those numbers killed 8 men, good men. I carried their deaths on my back for 6 years because of you. You turned failure into profit. Now you're going to turn it into purpose. Hale looked up sharply. Purpose? I don't want your money, Eli said. I want you to build something that lasts longer than your lies. He placed a folded document on the desk. This outlines the founding of the Mariner Atlas Rescue Institute. You'll fund it in perpetuity, a training center for maritime engineers and rescue personnel, real equipment, real standards, not paper promises. The CEO's eyes flicked down to the proposal, then back to Eli. And if I refuse? Eli didn't answer with words. He simply reached into his jacket pocket and set a small USB drive beside the photos. That's a dead man's switch, he said quietly. Every 24 hours, it checks for my login. If I miss one, even by accident, that drive sends every file, every recording, and every serial number to the Federal Maritime Commission, the press, and the families of the men who died on the Mercy Star. Silence filled the room, dense, heavy, final. The only sound was the faint tick of the clock and the soft pant of Atlas by Eli's side. Hale looked from the drive to the old man standing before him, and for the first time, he seemed smaller. You're asking me to tear down my own company, Hale said. No, Eli replied. I'm asking you to rebuild it into something that deserves its name. For a long moment, Hale said nothing. Then he sat back, exhaled, and stared out the window towards the vast gray ocean beyond the glass. The horizon stretched endless, beautiful, and merciless. Finally, he nodded once. You'll have your institute, he said quietly. Mariner Atlas Rescue. It's poetic, I'll give you that. Eli gave a single nod. Poetry doesn't matter. Only the living do. He turned to leave, Atlas rising beside him. At the doorway, Hale's voice followed, softer now. Mr. Moran. Why Atlas? Eli paused. Because he carried the weight of the world, he said, then walked out into the sunlight. 5 years passed, and Rockford Harbor no longer whispered of ghosts. Where once rusted cranes and abandoned ships leaned like forgotten gravestones, now stood rows of white training halls trimmed with blue steel. The sign over the main pier read, The Atlas Rescue Institute, letters carved deep and clean into oak. Beyond it, young cadets in orange wetsuits shouted over the wind, their laughter rising with the cry of gulls. Buoys bobbed across the glimmering water, each one flashing steady and bright. Not distress signals, but the rhythm of renewal. Eli Moran stood on the dock, hands tucked into his jacket pockets. His hair had turned fully silver, and his posture had softened with time. Yet there was still the quiet strength of a man built by storms. The years had carved lines across his face, not of bitterness, but of use, like wood shaped by the sea. His blue eyes, though dimmer now, held a calm that had taken half a lifetime to earn. Beside him sat Atlas, older still, his muzzle white, his gait slower, but his eyes, those amber eyes, burned clear and patient. The dog watched the cadets run drills, his ears flicking with interest every time a buoy hit the waves. "You'd have liked this," Eli murmured. "All this noise, it means they're alive." A woman approached from the administration building, her pace brisk but unhurried. Evelyn Cruz, now in her early 40s, had traded her leather reporter's jacket for a windbreaker with the Institute's emblem stitched on the sleeve. Her dark hair was shorter, streaked faintly with silver, and her sharp eyes had softened without losing their fire. She had joined the Institute 2 years after the scandal broke, when the Mariner Atlas program became public. She now served as Director of Ethics and Training Outreach, overseeing education on maritime safety and corporate accountability. "They passed the test," she said, smiling as she stopped beside him. "All 8 units. No leaks, no faults. First batch in 20 years to meet every standard." Eli nodded, gaze fixed on the water. "Good. Then maybe the ocean will take mercy on the next ones." Evelyn studied him for a moment, then reached into her coat pocket and handed him a small medal. Bronze, etched with the Institute's insignia. "We named the engineering hall after you," she said. "You didn't show up to the ceremony." Eli chuckled, low and rough. "Ceremonies were never my thing. You earned this one." He turned the medal in his hand, thumb brushing the raised letters. "In honor of integrity and vigilance." For a moment he said nothing. Then he crouched slowly, knees creaking, and clipped the medal onto Atlas's collar. "You carried more than I ever did," he whispered to the dog. Atlas looked up, tail thumping faintly. Evelyn smiled, then glanced toward the western horizon. The sun was lowering into the sea, its light spilling gold over the harbor. The new buoys shone like floating embers, each pulse of light steady as a heartbeat. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Turning them in? Hail Mariner? All of it?" Eli didn't answer at once. He watched the cadets hauling ropes, heard their laughter rise against the surf. "No," he said finally. "The sea doesn't care about regret. It only gives you back what you put into it. Lies sink. Truth floats." Evelyn nodded. "And justice?" "Justice," he said, looking toward the Institute's main building, "is when the next generation never needs to ask what went wrong." A bell sounded across the harbor, the shift ending. The students began to gather their gear, calling to one another, boots splashing through the shallows. Eli turned toward the pier's end, where an old wooden bench faced the water. He walked slowly, Atlas following. They sat together, as they always had. The sun dipped lower, painting the waves in bronze and rose. The air smelled of salt and clean steel, not rust. He reached down and rested his hand on the dog's head. Atlas's fur trembled slightly under his palm, but his eyes stayed bright, watching the horizon. "We did it, boy," Eli whispered. The words came with no pride, only peace. The wind moved through the rigging, carrying faint echoes of laughter, not the haunted kind, but living sound. The harbor lights flickered on, one by one, steady and warm. Across the water, the new buoys blinked in perfect rhythm, their signals synchronized. No ghostly SOS, no false alarms, only the living pulse of safety and renewal. The last light of day caught the Institute's name in gold, the Atlas Rescue Institute. The letters glowed like a promise. Sometimes miracles don't come as burning lights or angelic voices. They come quietly, like a tide turning after a long storm. In Eli's world, the miracle was not the sea giving back what it had taken, but God giving him the strength to keep believing in truth when it would have been easier to forget. Every light that now blinks across Rockford Harbor is a reminder that even from guilt, grace can rise, and that no wound is too deep for redemption if we let faith steer the helm. Perhaps that's what the Lord's work really is, not to erase our storms, but to teach us how to sail through them, carrying others toward safety. So if you've ever faced regret or felt your soul weighed down by something you can't fix, remember Eli and his faithful Atlas. Their story is proof that when we choose integrity over silence, God works his quiet miracles through human hands. The sea, like life, rewards those who refuse to sink. If this story touched your heart, please share it. Leave a comment about what you believe redemption means, and subscribe to our channel for more stories of faith, courage, and the unseen hand of God guiding the lost home again. May the Lord bless and protect you and your loved ones, and may every storm in your life end with light on the water.